A white passenger mocked a wounded black CEO mid-flight. Seconds later, the tables turned in a way no one on that plane will ever forget. He thought mocking a man's pain would make him powerful. He didn't realize the person he insulted could buy the company that made his ticket. Subscribe if you believe cruelty always finds its way back. The turbulence struck without warning. A sudden jolt rocked the aircraft, tilting glasses on tray tables and rattling overhead compartments. Kieran Vale gripped the armrest tightly, his breath catching as a sharp spike of pain flared through his left shoulder. The dressing beneath his navy suit shifted slightly, and he winced, not from fear of the turbulence but from the raw reminder of the wound still healing beneath polished fabric. His body tensed, but his face remained calm. From the corner of his eye he saw the man beside him shift as well, though not from discomfort. Darren Holt, mid-40s, pale skin, pale eyes, and a suit that looked like it belonged to someone playing the role of importance rather than earning it, leaned slightly toward him. "You all right there, champ?" Darren asked, his voice laced with mock concern. He gestured casually to Kieran's shoulder with the tip of his pen. "Looks like you're barely stitched together." Surprised they let you on board like that, Kieran didn't turn. His eyes remained fixed on the tablet in his lap, where the final slide of his keynote presentation glowed faintly in the dim cabin light. He tapped the screen once as if adjusting a detail, and then exhaled slowly through his nose. "I'm fine," he said. "Must be painful, though." "That kind of injury." "Nasty business," Darren went on, undeterred. He leaned back in his seat with exaggerated comfort, crossing one leg over the other and folding his arms as if preparing for a long, enjoyable conversation. "Accident, was it? Or something messier?" Kieran looked up briefly, locking eyes with the man. "Car crash, a month ago." "Ah," Darren nodded thoughtfully. "Right. You know, you should probably be resting instead of flying halfway across the country, unless someone like you has, I don't know, something to prove?" There was no misunderstanding in the tone. It wasn't curiosity, it was performance. Kieran had met the type before. Men who disguised antagonism with politeness, men who smiled while measuring your worth, and when they decided you didn't meet their silent standard, found subtle ways to degrade you under the guise of friendliness. "I'm attending a conference," Kieran said. His voice was even, composed. "Of course you are," Darren replied, a flicker of something smug dancing behind his eyes. "Big shot CEO, right? Neural something or other?" "Neural regeneration," Kieran said. "Meridian Biotech." Right. "Fancy," Darren replied, drawing out the word like it tasted sour. "Those suits at Hellison must be shaking in their boots." Kieran's eyes narrowed for the briefest moment, then dropped back to his tablet. "If you'll excuse me, I need to review a few final points." But Darren didn't move. He didn't even blink. He just smiled again, casual, almost amused, and leaned back in his seat as the plane leveled out. Around them, the cabin returned to its calm hum. The faint scent of lemon-scented wipes and recycled air drifted beneath the overhead vents. The tray tables clicked softly as a few passengers returned to their meals or screens. But Kieran felt the tension hang in the space between him and Darren like a thread stretched tight and fraying. He refocused on the tablet, scrolling through charts, metrics, projections, anything to anchor his mind. The pain in his shoulder had dulled slightly but still throbbed with a steady rhythm. He shifted his posture, subtly angling his body away from Darren, and took a quiet breath. He had worked years, decades, for this moment. This deal. This chance to change the future of medical science. He would not be rattled by a seatmate with a cruel streak and too much time on his hands. But Darren wasn't finished. "You know," Darren said after a beat, as if he couldn't help himself, "it's funny how the rules bend when people like you walk in." Kieran looked up again, but this time slower. "People like me?" he repeated. Darren shrugged. "Don't take it the wrong way. Just seems like you're getting a lot of special treatment. The bandages, the shoulder. I'm surprised they didn't stop you at security, but I guess when you've got a name, they don't check too closely, do they?" Kieran didn't respond. There was no right response. Any word would be twisted into justification for more provocation. He knew the script. He had lived it 100 different ways in boardrooms, press conferences, investor meetings. The provocation always came in polite rapping first, and then, when ignored, turned sharper. His hand slid into his coat pocket, fingertips grazing the edge of a slim silver pen. It was warm from the cabin heat. A prototype neural scanner, disguised to look ordinary. Its real function was data capture, notes, readings, moments of insight. Now, it served a different purpose. Kieran tapped it once, ensuring it was live. He wouldn't use it yet, but it helped to know that when words failed, evidence didn't. "Didn't mean to offend," Darren said, smiling faintly. "Just making conversation." The plane dipped slightly again, another pocket of turbulence sending a ripple through the cabin. Kieran braced his legs, adjusting for balance. Pain shot through his shoulder, sharper this time, raw. A faint gasp slipped past his lips before he could stop it. Darren turned his head, eyes lingering on the bandage with unsettling interest. "That bad, huh?" Kieran said nothing. "Yeah, definitely looks infected," Darren added, his voice lower now as if confiding in a friend. "They should have made you sit in the back." "For your safety, of course." Kieran finally turned to him again, gaze cold. "I don't need your concern," he said. For a moment, Darren didn't respond. Then he smirked. "I'll keep that in mind," he said, settling into his seat once more, but with a look that said he wasn't finished. Kieran leaned back and closed his eyes, trying to drown out the dull throb of his injury, the echo of Darren's words, and the deep current of unease running just beneath the surface. He had prepared for financial negotiations, corporate games, technical questions, and media appearances. He had not expected to find his first battle of the day in Seat 3B. Outside the window, the clouds shifted and parted, revealing a clear horizon. Inside, a storm was only just beginning. Sometimes the calm before cruelty hides in polite voices. Kieran jerked forward as something cold and thick pressed into the wound beneath his shoulder bandage. The pressure wasn't gentle. It was sudden, calculated. A sting exploded across the raw tissue like fire snapping through dry grass. At first, he couldn't even process what had happened. Then, the minty, burning sharpness invaded deeper, cutting through layers of healing flesh like glass dipped in acid. He screamed. It wasn't a sound he meant to make. It tore from his throat involuntarily, ragged and raw. The sterile calm of the cabin shattered instantly. Heads turned. Gasps rippled through the quiet darkness of the cabin as reading lights flickered on, one by one. "What did you do?" a passenger muttered in disbelief from behind. Kieran clutched his shoulder, eyes wide with shock. His fingers trembled as they pressed against the soaked fabric. White gauze now streaked red and mint green. The sharp, acrid scent of toothpaste and blood rose into the recycled air. Beside him, Darren Holt sat back with a smirk that barely passed for regret. "Relax, man," he said with mock innocence, raising his hands as though startled by the reaction. "It was just toothpaste." "Thought I'd help. You looked like it needed cleaning." His voice was light, but his eyes glinted with something cold, satisfaction even. Kieran turned slowly toward him, his breathing ragged, his body locked between agony and disbelief. He wanted to speak, to say something that would pierce the smug shield wrapped around the man beside him, but words drowned under pain. He gritted his teeth, nostrils flaring. A moment later, Nolan, the flight attendant, rushed to the row. "What's going on?" Nolan's voice was sharp as he crouched beside Kieran, eyes scanning the soaked bandage and the tube of toothpaste still gripped in Darren's hand. "He assaulted me," Kieran managed to say, his voice hoarse. "He put that into my wound." Darren chuckled, waving the tube slightly. Oh, come on, it was a joke. You said your shoulder hurt. I figured mint might numb it. Like muscle rub, right? Nolan's face darkened. Sir, that's not even remotely funny. Kieran leaned back in his seat, pain radiating through his arm, neck, and jaw. His head spun, not just from the burn but from the humiliation. He knew this wasn't a joke. It wasn't even about pain. It was about power, about seeing how far someone could go before the victim snapped. And Kieran had nearly snapped. Other passengers were now filming, phones tilted over seatbacks capturing the aftermath. The hiss of whispers moved like wind through tall grass. Unbelievable, one man muttered. He's bleeding, said another. But Darren just shrugged. It's not like I stabbed him. Kieran heard it all but focused only on staying still. The muscles around his wound contracted violently, burning each time he shifted. His mind fought to stay calm. He couldn't afford to lose control, not now, not like this. Do you want medical attention? Nolan asked, gently touching Kieran's wrist. Kieran nodded once, lips pressed tightly together. He didn't trust his voice anymore. He could feel his self-control slipping, not in rage, but in despair. A familiar voice echoed in his head, his father's, telling him years ago, "Don't let their games change who you are. Control is power." Nolan stood, turned to Darren. Sir, you need to remain in your seat. I'm reporting this to the captain. You may be removed upon landing. Removed? Darren scoffed, still smiling. For toothpaste? Nolan didn't answer. He walked away briskly, speaking into his cabin communicator. Darren leaned back, chuckling to himself as if this entire exchange had been entertainment. Kieran turned his face toward the window, though all he saw was his reflection in the dark glass. Behind it, clouds drifted like ghosts. He looked pale, worn, and something else, wounded in a way that went beyond skin. You should be thanking me, Darren whispered, his tone lower now, colder. They're gonna believe you? You screamed like a child. Makes you look weak. Kieran didn't respond, not with words. But deep inside, something shifted. Something old and silent and calculating. He had survived bigger storms. He had built companies and boardrooms where people like Darren tried to break him with fake smiles and quiet sabotage. But never had one of them touched him. Physically, publicly, with such audacity. He let his eyes drift to Darren's lapel, where a lanyard just barely peeked from under his jacket. For the briefest second, the name was visible. Not Darren Holt, the traveler. Darren Holt of Hellison Pharmaceuticals. And then everything clicked. Kieran turned his head slowly, his breath steady despite the pain. Darren had been mocking him from the beginning, from the moment they boarded, from the moment he sat beside him. This hadn't been random. This was staged. A sting of betrayal cut through the pain. This wasn't just a personal attack. It was a professional hit, and Kieran realized he'd nearly played right into it. He closed his eyes for a moment, fighting the wave of fury swelling inside him. Every instinct wanted to strike, to scream, to grab the man and drag him down with him. But that would be their victory, not his. Nolan returned with another flight attendant, Miles, older, with graying hair and a firm expression. We're going to document what happened, Miles said, pulling out a tablet. Mr. Vale, if you're able, we'll need your account. Kieran opened his eyes, voice quiet but precise. I'll give it. But not now. I need the bleeding stopped. Miles nodded, turning toward the medical kit under the seat row. Darren gave a sideways glance, unimpressed. You know, Darren muttered under his breath as Miles worked. You CEOs think you're untouchable, but all it takes is one moment, one misstep. Then your empire cracks. Kieran didn't answer him directly. He kept his gaze ahead, jaw tight, focusing on his breathing, on the steady rhythm that had helped him through surgeries, betrayals, and losses before. This was no different, but something inside him had changed. Not shattered, sharpened. Pain burned deeper than skin. It reached the part of him that still believed reason could stop cruelty. Kieran's scream pierced the cabin, sharp and raw, a jagged sound that shattered the fragile stillness of flight. His back arched in reflex, shoulder jerking violently as the searing burn of mint and chemicals burrowed into the raw skin beneath his bandage. For a moment, all he could register was white-hot pain, sharp, blinding, and absolute. Passengers snapped out of their drowsy mid-flight trance, gasping, rising in their seats. Heads turned. A child whimpered. A phone camera light blinked on. Nolan, the young flight attendant who had earlier offered Kieran water, rushed back down the aisle, his face pale, eyes wide. "Sir, what just happened?" he demanded, his voice taut with panic as he kneeled beside Kieran's seat. Kieran's breath came in short, shallow gasps. His hand gripped the edge of the armrest with enough force to turn his knuckles white, blood and white foam dripping steadily through the torn fabric of his sleeve. The mint stung like acid, burrowing deeper into the wound with every heartbeat. Kieran hissed, barely forming words, "he squeezed it into my wound." Nolan turned sharply toward Darren, who was still holding the crumpled travel-sized toothpaste tube, a smirk twitching at the edge of his mouth. "Sir, what were you thinking?" Darren shrugged with exaggerated innocence, feigning surprise. He said it was bothering him. "I thought I was helping disinfect it. How was I supposed to know it was that sensitive?" "You thought toothpaste was first aid?" Nolan's voice cracked in disbelief. "You need to apologize." "Right now, I was trying to help," Darren said calmly, brushing invisible lint off his sharp gray blazer. "If he took it the wrong way, that's on him." The hum of the plane seemed louder now, the drone of engines merging with whispered conversations and the unmistakable sound of multiple phones recording. Passengers leaned into the aisle for a better look. Some whispered, others filmed. A second flight attendant, older and more composed, arrived at the scene. His name tag read Miles. His voice was level but firm as he assessed the situation. "What's going on here?" Nolan stood, flustered. This passenger just assaulted him. He squeezed something into his shoulder wound. "Not assaulted," Darren interrupted smoothly, already rehearsing his version. "He asked for help." "It's all a misunderstanding." Kieran leaned back, one hand still clamped over his shoulder. Blood and pale foam oozed between his fingers. He said nothing. Not yet. His silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. Miles looked between the two men, eyes narrowing slightly as he took in the blood-stained suit, the toothpaste tube, and the cluster of watching passengers. "Let's lower our voices," he said diplomatically. "Sir," he turned to Darren, "please return to your seat and remain there until the captain gives instructions." "I am in my seat," Darren said, gesturing smugly. "He's the one who started yelling." Kieran finally spoke, his voice quieter than anyone expected. "You don't get to rewrite this," he said. Darren leaned back with a casual smile. "It's all on camera," he said softly, just loud enough for Kieran to hear. "You really should have kept your cool." Kieran's eyes narrowed, and as his focus sharpened, something caught his attention. A small, glinting piece of metal partially tucked beneath Darren's blazer lapel. He shifted slightly, ignoring the pulsing burn in his shoulder. The edge of a lanyard. A tag. It had a logo, a circle with a neural vine wrapped around a helix. Helpless Pharmaceuticals. The sight froze him. It wasn't just recognition. It was realization. This wasn't random. Darren wasn't some arrogant stranger playing at passive-aggressive games. He was an employee of helpless, Kieran's rival biotech firm. The same company threatening to undercut the merger Meridian Biotech had spent years negotiating. And now, here he was, seated beside Kieran, making provocations look accidental and sabotaging his image mid-flight, surrounded by cameras and potential witnesses. This had never been a coincidence. Kieran's mind moved like a scalpel. He'd seen sabotage before, but never this brazen. Darren's real goal wasn't just to provoke him, it was to trap him. An outburst would have become a viral moment. Aggressive CEO attacks fellow passenger mid-flight. His composure, his reputation, and the government contract hanging in the balance, they were all bait. The toothpaste was never the attack. Kieran's reaction was the trap. He leaned back slowly, jaw clenched, heartbeat thundering in his ears. He saw Nolan looking at him, nervous, confused. He saw the phone still rolling. He saw Miles trying to contain the mess without escalating. He saw Darren, relaxed, confident, already planning how he would spin this on the ground. But what Darren didn't see was that the moment had already shifted. Kieran didn't need to fight. He needed to record. He slid his right hand into his coat pocket and pressed the activation button on a pen clipped to his inner jacket lining, a custom prototype. It wasn't just for writing. It was a neural scanner and audio recorder, discreet, encrypted, and already syncing with his cloud archive. Darren leaned over, lowering his voice. "Look at you," he said, mock sympathy dripping from every syllable. "You built your little empire and still can't handle a joke." Kieran didn't blink. "You'll regret what you touched," he murmured, just as Darren leaned in again. Darren laughed softly as if sharing a joke with a friend. "Come on, don't be dramatic." But Kieran didn't respond. He looked past Darren, past the curious faces and worried attendants, past the cameras and whispers. His face was still. His eyes were calm. But behind that calm was strategy, rage, and something sharper, clarity. He would not react. He would respond. The cameras kept rolling. The passengers kept filming. And Darren Holt, oblivious to the trap he thought he'd set, smiled with satisfaction. Kieran closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again, clear, focused, unshaken. In that moment, every breath he took was a calculation. Every second of restraint was a blade he would use later. And then, as the cabin returned to uneasy silence and Miles ushered Nolan aside to file a mid-air report, Kieran leaned back in his seat once more, blood still staining his sleeve, and whispered to himself, barely audible above the hum of the engines. Every trap loses power when you decide to wait before springing. The moment the captain's voice came over the intercom, sharp and clipped, announcing that both men would be placed under watch until landing, a new kind of silence settled over the cabin. Not the soft lull of a routine flight, but a watchful, strained quiet, the kind that hummed with tension just beneath its surface. Darren Holt leaned back in his seat, arms folded, the corners of his mouth turned upward in a smug grin. He looked like a man who had won something. Kieran Vale, however, sat still, his gaze cast downward, as if studying the outline of his briefcase on the floor. But inside his mind, the pieces were already moving. He could still feel the burn in his shoulder, raw, angry tissue throbbing beneath the bandages, but the fire in his chest had transformed. This wasn't pain anymore. It was purpose. He shifted slightly, just enough to bring his phone up against the side of his leg, out of sight. With practiced calm, he opened a secure app and began typing with his thumb. Need confirmation on passenger next to me. Name, Darren. Mid-40s, white. Helpless connection suspected. The response came less than a minute later. Mason Redden. He's Darren Holt. Confirmed. PR Division. Helpless. Known for sabotage ops. Check your email. Just sent his internal profile. Kieran stared at the message for a moment, his jaw tightening. The truth snapped into place like a lock engaging. This hadn't been random. Holt was planted here, not just to provoke him, but to ruin him, and worse, to make him look like he had unraveled under pressure. He slid the phone back into his pocket and adjusted his posture, breathing in through his nose to keep his expression steady. The man beside him was still basking in false victory, whispering smug comments to himself, low enough that they wouldn't be picked up by casual ears but loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Arrogant CEOs think they're above it all," Darren muttered, shaking his head. Bet he won't forget this flight. Kieran tilted his head subtly and pulled out what appeared to be a silver pen from the side pocket of his laptop case. He clicked the top twice. A soft blue light blinked near the base, a signal only he understood. It wasn't a pen. It was a neural scanner prototype with audio record functionality. The device began recording as Holt leaned toward the aisle and said in a performative whisper, "Someone had to teach him a lesson. Bet the board won't like seeing him cry on camera." A few rows ahead, a young man glanced over, clearly uncomfortable, but he didn't speak. Kieran knew the psychology. Bystanders witnessed injustice but often froze, unsure whether to intervene or record, and some, like those filming earlier, did both. Minutes passed. The hum of the engines became a metronome for Kieran's thoughts. Outside the window, clouds rolled like waves beneath the belly of the plane. Then the captain's voice returned, announcing the start of descent. The cabin tilted ever so slightly as the aircraft began its slow glide downward. Kieran allowed his shoulders to slump just enough to sell the image. He moved slowly, as though fatigued, blinking hard and wincing as he reached under the seat in front of him. Darren, half watching, couldn't resist. "You all right there, champ?" Darren said with mock sympathy. "Need a hand with that bag of yours?" Kieran didn't answer right away. He turned his head, meeting Darren's eyes for the first time in over an hour. The look wasn't angry. It wasn't broken either. It was surgical, controlled, and cold. "If you don't mind," Kieran said softly, almost too softly. Darren reached over, grinning, always eager to play the Good Samaritan when the spotlight suited him. As his hand brushed the handle of Kieran's bag, Kieran leaned in just slightly, his voice a whisper sharp enough to cut through steel. "You'll regret what you touched." Darren paused, blinking, caught off guard. But then he chuckled, dismissing the statement like a joke told by someone clearly outmatched. "Sure thing, buddy," he said. "Whatever helps you sleep tonight." Kieran didn't answer. He leaned back in his seat and clicked the pen once more. The light turned green. The data had synced, uploaded in real time to a secure cloud drive, time-stamped, geotagged, and encrypted. Every sentence Darren had uttered in the last 15 minutes, every brag, every slur, was now stored beyond deletion. Darren returned the bag to the floor and sat back with the air of someone who believed the performance was over. Kieran stared ahead, his breathing steady, the pain in his shoulder no longer the most pressing burn. In his mind, the lines were already drawn. This man had been sent to break him publicly. But now, Kieran had something better than revenge. He had proof. And, more importantly, he had the patience to use it at the right time. The fasten seatbelt sign dinged overhead. The engines shifted in tone as the landing gear deployed. Outside, the city lights of Vermont began to twinkle into view beneath the clouds. The descent had begun, in more ways than one. Inside his chest, Kieran felt something click. Not rage, not vengeance, but resolve. And as the cabin prepared for landing, his thoughts returned to a quiet phrase that rose and settled like breath in a storm. When revenge plans itself through patience, the guilty mistake your silence for surrender. The wheels screamed against the tarmac as Flight 47 touched down at Vermont International. The moment the aircraft slowed to a halt near the gate, tension burst through the cabin like a split wire. A sharp chime rang overhead. Passengers unbuckled hastily, but no one moved toward the aisle. Eyes darted, murmurs spread. The scent of antiseptic and dried mint lingered, an unnatural blend that clung to Kieran's suit and skin. He remained seated, his right hand clamped tightly over the blood-stained bandage on his left shoulder, where the toothpaste had burned deep into the healing tissue. Pain radiated up his neck, each throb like a hammer against bone. But Kieran didn't wince. Not here. Not yet. The cameras were still rolling, phones angled from the row ahead and behind, capturing his stillness, his breath, his restraint. 2 uniformed airport security officers stepped into the cabin moments later. Their expressions were stiff, Unreadable. "Dr. Vale?" one asked. Kieran slowly rose. His voice came low but firm. "Yes." "Please come with us." He nodded once. As he turned, Darren Holt rose as well, smirking like someone being escorted into a press conference, not a security office. A thin cut on his lip had dried into a scab, self-inflicted in the earlier scuffle to make himself look like a victim. He gave Kieran a sideways glance. "No hard feelings, right?" "Just a misunderstanding." Kieran said nothing. His silence made Darren smile wider. They were taken off the plane separately. Kieran was led through a service corridor, dim, metallic, and echoing with each step of the officer's boots. The fluorescent lights above flickered in patches, casting shadows across the dull gray floor. At the end of the corridor, a pair of medics stood waiting with a stretcher and a rolling trauma kit. "We need to take a look at that wound now, sir," one said, but Kieran held up his good hand. "Statement first," he said. "I want everything on record before anyone touches me." The medics exchanged glances. "Sir, with respect—" "Record it," Kieran said again, his voice steady despite the tremble beneath it. This was not a passenger dispute. This was calculated. The officer at his side hesitated. "We've been told it's under review," he offered vaguely. "That's not good enough," Kieran replied, locking eyes with the man. "Get your supervisor." The moment hung heavy in the air. The officer nodded reluctantly and stepped away to call for authorization. And then the door at the end of the hall burst open. Mason Redden entered, briefcase in one hand, tablet in the other. He was out of breath, his tie loosened, his coat half-buttoned. But his eyes were sharp, scanning the room, locking onto Kieran, and then shifting to the security officer. "You're going to want to hear this," Mason said. He opened the tablet with a quick swipe, then held it up. A screen loaded with Hellison internal files, digital receipts, wire transfers, meeting logs. At the center was one file, stamped and time-coded. Darren Holt, Incentive Performance Bonus. "Recognize that name?" Mason asked, directing the question to the officer. "That's the man who assaulted my client. He's not a random passenger. He's a paid operative. This was sabotage." The officer's brow tightened. "Where did you get this?" "Anonymous leak. We traced it through proxy chains. It links Holt directly to Hellison's strategic disruption arm." Kieran stepped forward, blood visibly soaking the edge of his dressing. "They paid him to provoke me." "On the record. Now will you treat this seriously?" The officer didn't answer, but his hesitation cracked, and he turned to the medics. "Start treating him." "I'll escalate this immediately." As the medics set to work, peeling back the dressing, one of them winced. Paste burned straight through the gauze. "That's deep tissue damage. You'll need skin decontamination." Kieran gritted his teeth as saline touched the wound. "Just clean it enough for transport." "I'll finish treatment later. Sir, this level of damage—" "Later." One medic nodded and began dressing the area again, more carefully this time. Kieran sat still, muscles tense, barely blinking. His phone vibrated in his pocket. Mason reached for it, unlocking the screen as Kieran nodded. His eyes scanned the latest headline flashing across the display. CEO assaulted mid-flight. Disturbing footage leaks online. Mason exhaled. It's spreading. A video clip had made it to the news. It was grainy, likely from a passenger's phone, but unmistakable. Darren leaning forward, squeezing a tube of toothpaste into Kieran's wound. The black CEO jolting in agony. The silence of the cabin ruptured by his restrained scream. Comments poured in. Some horrified, some skeptical. But the tide was turning. Then the next alert hit. Hellison Pharmaceuticals. We do not condone the behavior of Darren Holt and deny any official association. Mr. Holt acted as a concerned citizen attempting to assist a fellow traveler in distress. Kieran blinked, jaw tightening. He turned the screen slowly toward Mason. "They're denying him?" Mason asked, his voice laced with disbelief. Of course, Kieran murmured. They're setting up their scapegoat early. But we have proof. Documents. Bonuses. He's in their system. They'll say he went rogue. That he wasn't authorized. They'll paint him as an overzealous employee acting alone. Kieran's voice was calm, almost cold. And we'll make sure the world sees how carefully they tried to erase their fingerprints. Mason leaned forward. I'll contact Theo Laren. He's been chasing Hellison's PR manipulation playbook for months. Kieran nodded faintly. The pain in his shoulder was rising again, but he no longer focused on it. The physical injury had become background noise to a deeper reality, one filled with orchestrated narratives, corporate deception, and silent wars waged with image and influence. He leaned back on the gurney as they wheeled him into the ambulance. The siren hadn't been activated. This wasn't an emergency by medical standards, but Kieran knew better. The emergency was already in motion, invisible and far-reaching. He stared through the tinted windows at the city skyline approaching. Not once did he look at the medics or the traffic outside. His eyes were fixed forward, but his mind ran behind. He had survived the assault, but the cover-up had just begun. As Mason climbed in beside him, flipping through documents already flagged for legal escalation, Kieran whispered to no one in particular, just the air, the noise, the quiet war surrounding him. They thought the flight was the end. For him, it was only the opening act. The sting hadn't faded. Even as Kieran lay in the Stark hospital bed, his shoulder packed with sterile gauze and numbing gel, the burn still clawed its way through his nerves. Not just the chemical sear of toothpaste in a raw wound, but the humiliation, the manipulation, the setup. Monitors blinked beside him, silent witnesses to the storm churning behind his eyes. The curtain separating him from the hallway swayed faintly with the drafts of passing nurses. Somewhere down the corridor, a monitor beeped in rhythm, unnervingly calm compared to the turmoil inside his mind. Kieran stared at the ceiling tiles, still wearing the same tailored navy pants and blood-specked shirt from the flight. They'd cut his blazer off to access the wound, but he'd refused painkillers. Pain helped him think. At 4:17 a.m., the door creaked. Mason Redden stepped in, his frame backlit by the hallway's cold light. No words yet, just the sound of his steps growing closer. His face said enough. Sleepless, jaw locked, frustration carved into his features. They've already started, Mason muttered, placing a tablet on the bed tray. Hellison hired a firm out of Braylock, Galen Strategies, crisis containment specialists, one of the best, or worst, depending on how you see it. He pulled up a video. Kieran's eyes narrowed. The clip was grainy, short, 20 seconds of cabin footage showing Kieran shouting in pain, hand to his shoulder, Darren Holt holding up his hands innocently. No context, no toothpaste, no sarcasm, no attack. Circulating everywhere, Mason continued. They're calling it a misunderstanding. Claiming you overreacted. That, maybe. You pushed his hand away too hard. They're rewriting it before people even ask what happened. Kieran's mouth tightened. And the full footage? Still locked. Aviation security says only law enforcement or internal investigation can access the cabin's raw feed. Mason's tone was clipped. But I've got calls out. A friend at Civil Air Review owes me. Kieran leaned back, exhaling through his nose. His mind wasn't racing, it was calculating. They've reduced it to theater, he said finally. They want it to look like I was unhinged. That I overplayed a harmless gesture. His fingers flexed slightly at his side, careful not to touch the dressing. But toothpaste in an open wound isn't harmless. It's not a misunderstanding. It's precise. The silence in the room held weight. I'm drafting a statement, Kieran said. Nothing reactive, no anger. I'll strip the emotion out of it and cut straight to the infection. Mason's brow furrowed. You sure that's the move? People expect emotion after something like this. They want to see fire. They'll see clarity, Kieran replied coolly. Integrity doesn't need to shout. It just needs to stand. Mason hesitated, then nodded slowly. All right, I'll get the communications team ready. Quiet, surgical release. But Kieran. His voice lowered. They changed his seat last minute. Holt was supposed to be in 17F, window seat, back of the plane. I checked the original manifest from last week. Kieran's gaze snapped up. So, someone moved him forward. Exactly. And I can't find any record of a passenger in your row canceling or rescheduling. That switch wasn't chance, it was assigned. Before Kieran could respond, there was a knock at the door. A man stepped inside, a tall figure in a charcoal coat, wireframe glasses, and a quiet intensity that filled the room before he even spoke. Dr. Niall Corrin. Kieran straightened slightly, surprised. Niall had once been a rival in the neuro-recovery biotech space, known more for ruthlessness than charity. The two had crossed wires in contract negotiations before, always on opposite sides of the line. Niall, Kieran greeted with a cautious nod. Didn't expect to see you here. Niall offered a faint smile but didn't sit. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a slim silver data stick. I'm not here as a rival, he said simply. I'm here because what they did crossed every line I swore I'd never ignore again. He placed the stick on the tray. Flight system logs. Backdoor pull from a friend in navigation operations. Shows Holt's seat reassignment flagged for manual override. Time stamped. 2 hours before boarding, Kieran picked up the drive, turning it in his fingers like a puzzle piece. This proves intent, he murmured. Not just intent, Niall added. It proves coordination. Someone with system access wanted Holt next to you, and I'd bet every dollar in my fund that it wasn't just him on that plane playing a role. Mason looked between them. Why bring this to us? Because I've played their game, Niall answered, and I saw what happens when no one holds the line. You did. That matters. For a long moment, the three men stood in the quiet tension of mutual recognition. Former competitors. Silent allies. Kieran looked down at the drive, then at the wall-mounted television flickering with news coverage already twisting the narrative. They used toothpaste as a weapon, he whispered, eyes cold and steady. But I'll use truth as mine. Kieran stood motionless in the center of his office, eyes locked on the frozen frame of Darren Holt's face displayed on the wall-sized screen. The image was pulled from in-flight footage, Holt mid-smirk, a tube of toothpaste in hand, his fingers gloved in cruelty. The room buzzed faintly from the cooling fans embedded into the server desk behind him. A storm was forming in Kieran's veins, not of rage, but of razor-sharp clarity. He turned to Mason, who stood near the console, jaw tight, eyes red from lack of sleep. Begin the internal trace, Kieran ordered quietly. Start with the last month's comm logs. Anyone with access to merger-sensitive data? Flag them. Mason nodded and moved fast, fingers dancing over the touchpad. The biometric locks sealed the office door behind them, isolating them from the rest of the Meridian Biotech campus. Outside, the lights of Halden City flickered beneath stormy skies. Inside, something colder stirred. An hour later, names began to scroll. IP logs, access timestamps, data clusters highlighted in red. Kieran watched it all in silence until one name blinked more than it should have. Rylan Farrow, Mason said, voice low as if speaking the name would break something. Senior engineer, Quantum Security Division, multiple late-night accesses, encrypted uploads. Kieran's lips pressed into a thin line. Rylan. He had recruited him 3 years ago. Brilliant, calm, precise, the kind of man who never raised his voice and always brought coffee to staff meetings. Quiet loyalty had always been his aura, but the data didn't lie. Mason dug deeper, pulling up mirrored server logs. He used an external drive to bypass the automated firewall. Look at this chain. 3 uplinks to an IP that routes back to a Helison satellite node in Farron Ridge. Kieran exhaled slowly, pressing his palm against the console. He sold us out. The moment hung in the room like smoke. Then Mason's phone buzzed. He's gone, Mason said after a brief call with security. Rylan cleared out his apartment last night. Took a car to the interstate. No trail beyond that. But he left this. Mason slid a flash drive across the table. Kieran took it and inserted it into the locked port. Encrypted emails bloomed onto the screen. The language was coded, but the meaning was sharp as broken glass. Disrupting Vale mid-flight should void any federal contract clauses if he reacts physically. Push him hard. You know what to do. Each email was time-stamped, linked to Helison execs, and ended with routing markers back to Damon Core's private server. The setup had been methodical. Darren Holt hadn't been a rogue provocateur. He had been an instrument, a staged match thrown onto dry kindling. Kieran stepped back, watching the screen as if it might blink away the truth. "They were hoping I'd snap," he murmured. "One punch, one moment of rage, and I would have lost everything. But you didn't," Mason said. "No," Kieran whispered, eyes narrowing. "I didn't." Outside, rain began to tap against the glass. It was soft at first, then harder, like the world was trying to wash itself clean. Mason shifted toward another monitor. "Want me to trigger deletion locks? Wipe access?" Kieran shook his head. "Too late." Damon already started purging, but we mirrored their cloud the moment the transfer protocols activated. He brought up the synced files. Thousands of documents, payment trails, VPN logs, emails, and most damning, a list titled Priority Disruption Profiles. His name sat at the top. "They wrote my downfall in ink," Kieran said softly, voice calm now, but electric with resolve. His reflection in the monitor was stark, eyes lit by screens, not fury, just purpose. "I'll rewrite it in fire." Hellison's legal ambush landed the moment Kieran stepped out of the medical complex. A courier handed him the envelope without a word, bold red letters across the top, notice of intent to sue. Inside was a formal complaint accusing him of defamation and intentional disruption of corporate reputation. He read the words with a flat expression, though a storm brewed beneath. In less than an hour, news networks caught wind. By mid-afternoon, every media outlet had latched onto the story, spinning theories like flies swarming a wound. Television anchors dissected footage on loop, most showing only the moments after Darren's assault. On one panel, a commentator leaned forward and asked the question that struck hardest. Did Kieran Vale provoke this, or is there more than meets the eye? Kieran watched from a quiet corner of his office, eyes narrowed, lips drawn tight. They didn't know the truth yet, but soon they would. He turned to Mason, who stood by the door, arms crossed, phone buzzing every few seconds with incoming calls and alerts. "Leak the data," Kieran said quietly. Mason looked up. "How much?" "Enough to make them curious," Kieran replied, "but not enough to scare them into silence. Just enough to make them reach for their weapons." That night, a small batch of documents was released anonymously, emails, brief internal memos, and one cryptic file referencing Targeted Executive Disruption Strategy, Priority Level Red. The world smelled blood, but didn't know whose it was yet. Hellison's executives scrambled. Damon Core held a late-night press briefing, dismissing the documents as manipulated nonsense and doubling down on their defamation claim. Kieran watched from the backseat of a dark car as it drove through Halden's industrial district. He didn't blink when cameras showed his name scrolling under headlines, CEO, silent after legal threat. In truth, he was heading to a quiet meeting that no headline could touch. The office of Roland Merrick was tucked inside a nondescript government building behind the Federal Corporate Ethics Bureau. No signage, no public access. Just a silent, guarded entry and a single light glowing through a frosted glass door. Roland opened it himself. He was in his early 50s, graying at the sides but sharp-eyed and lean. "You look tired," he said as Kieran entered. "I've looked worse," Kieran muttered, removing his coat, wincing as it brushed his healing shoulder. Roland motioned toward a secure table with shielding equipment. "Let's see what you've got." Kieran reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a silver device, roughly the size of a pen, with a digital lock. He placed it on the table and tapped a code. The holographic display projected upwards, casting pale blue light across the room. Mason had compiled everything: audio clips of Holt boasting to fellow passengers, the altered seat manifest, payment bonuses traced back to Hellison, even time-stamped data showing Holt's access to flight logs days before boarding. Roland stared in silence. His fingers hovered over the playback file labeled Subject Holt, Cabin Conversation, timestamp 2:13:46. He pressed play. Darren Holt's voice oozed confidence from the speakers. "These CEOs think they're untouchable. Sometimes you've got to teach them how high they really fly before they fall." A pause. Then laughter. Kieran's face remained unreadable, but his hands clenched slightly at his sides. When the file ended, Roland leaned back slowly, his chair creaking beneath him. The weight of what he'd heard settled like dust in a courtroom. "This isn't corporate rivalry," Roland said at last, voice low, almost reverent. "This is organized manipulation." Kieran didn't move. He simply stared at the projection as if it were a battlefield map. Then he turned to Roland. His voice, when it came, was calm, cold. "Then let's give them a demonstration of what organized justice looks like." He poured toothpaste onto the CEO's injured shoulder, laughing while passengers turned away. If you believe arrogance under disguise deserves exposure, hit subscribe now. Because justice doesn't burn, it reveals. The video hit the internet like a thunderclap. Unedited, raw, and damning. There was no music, no filter, no explanation. Just the sterile hum of the airplane cabin, and a single moment burned into the eyes of anyone who watched. Darren Holt, in his pressed gray suit, leaned forward with a casual smirk and squeezed a thick line of white toothpaste directly into Kieran Vale's open shoulder wound. The scream that followed sliced through the cabin like broken glass, a sound so visceral it silenced even the hum of the engines. Gasps followed. One passenger dropped their phone. Another fumbled to cover their mouth. Kieran writhed, gripping the armrest with white knuckles while Darren recoiled, laughing nervously as if he'd spilled water on someone's shirt. Within 6 hours of the leak, the footage had been shared across every major platform. By the 10th hour, it had crossed international media lines. Anchors described the scene with disbelief. What appears to be a deliberate act of cruelty mid-flight. The CEO of Meridian Biotech subjected to an act that resembles chemical assault. Corporate sabotage or a personal vendetta, commentators speculated, but the public needed no guidance. Outrage took form in hashtags, petitions, and protest groups organizing in real time. Outside Hellison Pharmaceuticals' headquarters in Cardale Plaza, a crowd had formed by early morning. Men in suits stood awkwardly behind velvet ropes while younger protesters in jackets and hoodies held signs that read, "Justice for Kieran," and "Your silence won't heal." That wound, camera crews jostled for angles as the footage looped on LED screens behind them. Inside a quiet conference room far from the chaos, Kieran watched it all unfold on a muted television. His bandaged arm rested on a cushion, still tender, still healing. But it wasn't the pain that held his gaze steady. It was the knowledge that the moment had finally arrived. The mask had slipped. The world had seen what he had endured. Mason entered the room without knocking. His tie was loosened, his phone still buzzing in his hand. "They froze Hellison's accounts," he said breathlessly. "Roland just called." Ethics Bureau executed an emergency seizure, asset protection, fraud investigation, the whole thing. Kieran nodded once, slow and steady. How's public sentiment? Overwhelmingly on your side. Even the big networks stopped hedging. Theo Laren's piece broke the timeline wide open. Holt's previous jobs, his ties to sabotage units inside Helpless, even that 2019 case in Toronto where the CEO, coincidentally, fell ill during a merger. Kieran didn't smile, but something shifted behind his eyes. Good, he said quietly, but we're not done. Mason stepped closer, dropping a folder onto the table. You'll want to see this. Roland's team found the approval trail. He flipped the folder open, revealing printed email chains. Core signed off on something called Operation Clipwire. Final notation: ensure Vale destabilizes publicly. Kieran's fingers hovered over the papers. He didn't need to read them, not because he didn't care, but because he already knew. The truth had always been beneath the surface. Now it was visible, tangible. Any sign of him? He asked. Damon Core? He hasn't left his compound since the story broke. Security everywhere. Legal teams claiming Holt acted off script. But that's falling apart now. Holt's already in custody. Kieran stood, carefully adjusting the sling that held his arm in place. They'll try to separate the man from the machine, he murmured. Pretend one can act without the other. Mason hesitated. What if they throw Holt under the bus completely? Say it was all him? Kieran turned toward the screen again. It showed a slowed-down version of the video, his own face contorted in pain, toothpaste dripping onto his suit, and Holt standing frozen, mouth half open as the cabin erupted around him. They'll try, Kieran said, but they're too late. The world's seen the hand. Now they want to know who moved it. A knock at the door interrupted them. One of Kieran's security personnel leaned in. It's on every channel, he said. They're walking him out. Kieran walked to the screen and turned up the volume. The image shifted to a live feed outside Hellison's main office. Damon Core, face pale and jaw clenched, was being escorted down the front steps in handcuffs. Two agents flanked him, while protesters roared behind metal barricades. His designer coat looked heavy against the cameras, his polished image cracking under the weight of consequence. He still thinks this is temporary, Mason muttered, that a few lawyers and a PR firm can fix it. Kieran didn't answer. His eyes stayed on the screen, watching as Core was loaded into a federal vehicle, his head lowered but his expression unreadable. Holt's image flickered next, being transferred from a holding cell, his smirk gone, his eyes hollow. Everything they'd built on manipulation and silence had crumbled in the space of a single truth, caught on camera. A reporter's voice echoed from the television. Authorities confirm that this arrest stems from an orchestrated attack aboard Flight 47, involving Helpless Pharmaceuticals and its former PR executive, Darren Holt. Kieran didn't blink. His heart was steady. He hadn't needed to shout. He hadn't needed to fight with fists. He had only needed to wait for the world to see what they tried to hide. He reached for the remote, turned off the screen, and let the silence settle around him like a warm coat. Justice doesn't shout, he murmured. It waits until silence becomes a spotlight. The gavel struck once, silencing the rising murmurs in the chamber. Kieran Vale took his seat at the witness table, his back straight, his expression unreadable. The tribunal courtroom, a high-ceilinged space rimmed with dark oak panels and polished brass fixtures, was packed with observers. Rows of government officials, biotech investors, corporate attorneys, and journalists filled every seat. Cameras were stationed at the periphery, their red lights blinking like sentinels waiting to record either a fall or a reckoning. He adjusted the cuff of his jacket with a steady hand, though beneath the fabric the scar on his shoulder throbbed with memory more than pain. He'd rehearsed this moment a dozen times in his mind, but now that it had come, he didn't need the script. The presiding chairman, a silver-haired official named Warren Delcroft, leaned forward. Dr. Vale, he began, voice echoing in the chamber. We understand you have prepared a statement. You may proceed. Kieran stood. His gaze swept the room slowly, not defiantly, but deliberately. He wanted them all to see he wasn't afraid. He wasn't angry. He was focused. I won't recount the incident in full, he said. The footage has been seen. The reports have been read. What I will say is this. What happened aboard Flight 47 was not a spontaneous act of cruelty. It was a calculated maneuver in a long-standing pattern of corporate sabotage. The audience remained silent, transfixed. Kieran's voice didn't waver. It wasn't loud, but it carried. I was humiliated. I was physically assaulted. And afterward, I was painted as unstable, an image carefully crafted to collapse a merger that would have elevated Meridian Biotech and threatened a competing corporation's dominance. That wasn't a coincidence. It was design. He paused, letting the words settle like dust after an explosion. One of the tribunal board members, a narrow-eyed man with a stern jawline, interjected, Are you claiming the act was orchestrated from within a rival company? I'm not claiming, Kieran replied. I'm confirming. The digital paper trail is intact. Payments, forged emails, edited footage, and tampered seat assignments documented. The attack was not about me as a man. It was about me as a symbol. I represented change, and they tried to destroy that before it could take root. A few gasps rippled through the gallery. Even the seasoned stenographer's fingers hesitated for a beat. Kieran stepped away from the microphone slightly, allowing the shift in tone to take effect. I'm not here to demand punishment, he continued. I'm here to demand protection. Not for me, but for every innovator, every executive, every builder whose progress threatens the old guard. Sabotage in the corporate world has evolved. It's no longer just hostile takeovers or market manipulation. It's character assassination, psychological warfare, public deception. He turned to face the panel directly now. I propose the creation of a National Accountability Act for corporate sabotage, a legally binding framework to track, investigate, and punish attempts to interfere with rival institutions through deceit, manipulation, or character defamation. Not as revenge, he added firmly, but as prevention. The room sat frozen for several long seconds. Then Delcroft cleared his throat and leaned in. That is a serious proposal, Dr. Vale. Do you have any evidence suggesting this is a pattern beyond your case? Kieran nodded once. I've submitted 3 case studies to the Ethics Bureau prior to this session, all showing similar tactics used on other companies, less public ones. The only difference is they didn't fight back. Whispers broke out in the back rows, reporters scribbling, murmurs of recognition from business leaders who may have quietly endured the same. Kieran looked to his left and saw Mason seated near the gallery wall, hands clasped tightly in front of him, his expression carved from steel. Beside him sat Roland Merrick, the federal liaison, eyes narrowed with approval. Both men gave the faintest nods. One of the younger board members leaned toward the chairman, whispering something. Another flipped through the documents Kieran had submitted earlier, scanning rapidly. Delcroft adjusted his microphone. Dr. Vale, if this panel were to initiate formal investigation into wider corporate interference networks, what would you consider the first priority? Kieran didn't hesitate. Transparency enforcement between rival entities, independent review of public relations contracts, and digital forensic access across high-risk sectors. Without visibility, corruption thrives. Silence fell again, but this time it felt different, heavier, shifted. The chairman turned to confer briefly with the other tribunal members. For 30 long seconds, only hushed voices and the rustle of papers filled the space. Finally, Delcroft turned back toward Kieran and spoke into the microphone. The panel has heard your testimony. By unanimous agreement, we are approving an immediate investigation into all existing reports of corporate interference. Your proposal will be formally drafted for legislative review within 30 days. We thank you, Dr. Vale, for your clarity and your courage." The room erupted, not in chaos, but in applause. Kieran blinked slowly as the weight of the moment pressed against his chest, not crushing him, but grounding him. He stepped back from the podium and turned toward the exit, Mason already standing. As he reached the tall glass doors leading to the tribunal stone steps, the cameras outside flashed in quick succession. Reporters shouted his name. Microphones reached for his voice, but he ignored them. He paused only once, standing at the top of the stairs. The light caught his scar just beneath the collar, reflecting faintly in the sunlight. His breath came slow and steady. Then he whispered to no one, and to everyone. The wound they made became the mark of something greater. The silver scar on Kieran Vale's shoulder caught the conference room light just as he adjusted his suit jacket. It shimmered faintly, a quiet reminder of the flight that had nearly ruined him. Months had passed since the toothpaste attack, and though his body had healed, something inside him hadn't. The pain was gone, yes, but in its place was a stillness that didn't feel like peace. It felt like preparation. The meeting had just ended, Meridian Biotech's quarterly summit with their new investors. Faces beamed across the long oval table. Contracts had been renewed. Funds had increased. Growth projections showed record highs. But Kieran's expression remained unreadable. He nodded in thanks, shook hands, made quiet eye contact, always calm, always exact. But beneath the surface, something lingered. After the last investor left, Mason Redden entered the room, holding a folder in one hand and 2 takeaway coffee cups in the other. He handed one to Kieran, but didn't speak immediately. Instead, he studied his friend for a long moment. Kieran stood near the window, overlooking the city skyline. The sun had just begun to set, casting golden lines along the metal frames of the buildings. The same light traced the outline of the scar on his shoulder where the fabric thinned slightly. "You know," Mason said, finally breaking the silence, "I watched you in there, and it felt like watching a statue. Solid, sharp, untouchable. Kieran didn't look away from the skyline. That's what they need me to be. But is it what you are?" Kieran turned slowly, his eyes sharper than usual, though not unkind. "They tried to burn me, Mason," he said, his voice low, steady, and somewhere in that fire, a part of me started burning everything that touched it. Mason sat down across from him, setting the untouched coffee beside his elbow. "Darren Holt took a plea deal today," he said. "He gave up everything, emails, voice recordings, even that training memo from Hellison's board. It's all out now. Damon Core's being transferred to federal custody next week. 32 years for corporate sabotage." "It's over." Kieran raised one eyebrow. "You think this is over?" Mason blinked, surprised. "You won." A faint smile crossed Kieran's lips, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Did I?" The room felt colder than the evening air. Kieran walked back toward the table, picked up one of the documents they'd reviewed earlier, an investment proposal from a startup in Portland. He flipped it open, revealing a letter handwritten by a 23-year-old founder who had modeled his pitch deck on Meridian's structure. "You inspired me," the young man had written. "When they tried to humiliate you, you didn't lash out. You stood taller. That's what a real leader looks like." Kieran read the line again, slowly, quietly. He set the page down with care. "They see strength. What they don't see is how much that strength costs." Mason folded his arms. "And what does it cost?" "Rest," Kieran said. "Trust. Even joy." There was a pause. Mason shifted in his seat. "You've changed," he said. Kieran nodded. "I had to." Behind them, the city glowed in the growing dusk. The lights turned on floor by floor in the nearby buildings, orderly, efficient, predictable. But inside Kieran, nothing felt predictable anymore. He saw enemies where there might be friends, sabotage behind every smile, manipulation beneath every compliment. His instincts had saved him, but they'd also sharpened into blades he couldn't put down. "Have you spoken to your brother lately?" Mason asked. Kieran shook his head. "Not since the hearing. He says I scare him now. Do you?" "I don't mean to," Kieran replied, "but I don't stop it either." The room fell into silence again. Mason looked at the untouched coffee between them, then picked it up and took a long sip. He studied his friend, the man who had once smiled at small victories, who used to hum under his breath when brainstorming breakthroughs. That man was still there, perhaps. But now, every part of him felt sharpened, like a tool that had been reforged too many times. "I'm just saying," Mason said gently, "don't lose the parts of you that existed before the fire." Kieran looked up slowly. "There's a reason people followed you back then," Mason continued, "and it wasn't fear." The lights flickered slightly as the building shifted into evening mode. Kieran exhaled and picked up a handful of letters from the folder Mason had brought, dozens more thank you notes, printed emails, social media messages. They were from students, interns, young entrepreneurs, all thanking him for what he had done, for how he had endured, for refusing to break. He read a few quietly. One from a biotech researcher in Lagos who had stayed up through the night watching the ethics tribunal hearings. Another from a 14-year-old boy who said he wanted to become a CEO, just like Kieran, so I can protect people from bullies in suits. His fingers tightened around the paper, not from anger, but something deeper. Mason watched him closely. "They tried to burn me, Mason," Kieran repeated, softer this time. "And somewhere in that fire, a part of me started burning everything that touched it." He paused, looking out again at the scarlet line of the horizon. He didn't mean vengeance. He meant vigilance. That wary part of him that now questioned everything, even kindness. But as the sun dipped lower and the city shimmered gold, Kieran traced one finger over the faint scar on his shoulder just once. Then he reached for another letter and began to read. Not as a weapon, but maybe, just maybe, as a reminder that not everything had to burn. Yet. "Maybe scars aren't reminders of pain," he said. "Maybe they're signatures of endurance." Kieran stared at the envelope in Roland Merrick's hand without reaching for it. They were seated in a narrow glass-walled conference room on the 23rd floor of the Federal Corporate Ethics Bureau in Vermont, the city skyline stretching behind Roland like a quiet sea of glass. No formality today. Roland wore a charcoal blazer over a simple white shirt, sleeves rolled back, tension clear in his posture. The man didn't usually fidget. Today, his fingers tapped lightly against the envelope, waiting. "This isn't an offer," Roland said. His voice was steady, but low, as if wary of the walls themselves. "It's a request. One we wouldn't make unless we believed you were the only man who could lead this." Kieran's jaw tightened. He sat perfectly still, both hands resting on the edge of the black table. His shoulder had healed well, though the scar still flared faintly when the air got too cold. But this wasn't about old wounds. It was about what came after. He finally reached for the envelope, opened it slowly, and skimmed the contents. Legal authorization, proposed structure, budget, oversight roles, staff, power. Too much power. "You're asking me to chair an oversight body that will supervise corporate transparency between direct competitors," he said, voice even. "You realize what that puts me in the middle of?" Roland nodded. "Everyone. And everything." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was weighted, like the stillness before a verdict. Kieran exhaled slowly. "Why me?" Roland leaned forward, palms open. "Because you've already lived it. You didn't break when it was personal. You didn't retaliate with fists or flame. You held the line. You exposed the game without becoming part of it. We need someone who understands both the ambition and the damage. Kieran looked away, eyes tracing the city skyline. For a moment, he saw the face of Darren Holt, the smirk, the tube of toothpaste, the shock when justice turned back. He saw Damon Core's mugshot, the tribunal chamber, the cameras, the apologies too late to matter. "I've already given too much of my life to stopping corruption," Kieran murmured. "I'm not sure I have anything left to lead from inside it." Before Roland could answer, the door opened with a quiet hiss. Mason stepped in. No tie, dark coat folded over one arm. He'd heard enough from the hallway. "Then, make them lead through you," he said without missing a beat. "You've seen what corruption looks like up close. That makes you the one who can stop it." His voice didn't rise, but it didn't need to. The certainty in it hung heavier than any argument. Kieran turned back to the document. Words blurred for a second before he blinked and read again. Not a job, a reckoning. Later that month, the Consortium for Integrity and Innovation was launched in a press conference streamed worldwide from the Vermont Civic Center. The stage design was minimal. Clean white banners, Meridian Biotech's logo discreetly placed beside the new emblem, a golden ring split by a vertical line, symbolizing unity and clarity. Kieran wore a slate-gray suit, his expression composed but firm. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted. He gave them nothing more than a nod. The speech would come later. Today was for establishment. As dignitaries shook hands, Kieran stepped aside for a moment of quiet. A familiar figure approached from the edge of the room, Neil Corin. No cameras followed him, no entourage. Just a man in his 50s, once a rival, now something else. "You're not the man I expected to lead this," Niall said, his tone soft but honest. "But maybe that's the point." Kieran offered a slight smile. "You were the only one who didn't try to profit off the chaos." That counts. Niall handed him a small black folder. "Independent audit proposal. My firm wants in, under your terms." Kieran opened it, scanned, nodded. "Transparent." "Blinding," Niall replied. They both chuckled quietly. Then Niall's face turned thoughtful. "You know, in business, we're taught that competition means survival. Outlast, outperform, undermine. That's what we were trained to believe." Kieran glanced at him, one brow raised. Niall continued. "But you taught me it can mean evolution." Kieran didn't speak immediately. He looked past Niall, toward the stage where the new banner gleamed beneath the spotlights. Behind it, the city's lights began to blink on. Offices, towers, homes, lives. So many unknowable choices behind every window. Then he turned back, a quiet conviction behind his voice. "Only when you stop fighting shadows and start building light." Niall gave a small, knowing nod. The handshake that followed wasn't ceremonial. It was earned. The event ended. The guests departed. The room emptied slowly. Later that night, as Kieran stood alone in the echoing foyer of the Civic Center, his reflection shimmered faintly in the glass wall beside him. The overhead lights cast long, slanted shadows across the marble floor. His own shadow looked taller somehow, not heavier, just older. He didn't feel victorious. He didn't feel angry. He felt responsible, and that feeling, for the first time, felt right. His phone buzzed. A message from Mason. Press already calling it a milestone. "You okay?" Kieran typed back only 2 words. "I'm ready." And he was. His calm demeanor returned, but behind it was purpose, a man who no longer sought revenge, only reform. Some victories, he thought, echo far beyond the battlefield. A year later, the auditorium lights dimmed as the final session of the Meridian Ethics Summit began. A hush settled over the vast, glass-paneled hall as Dr. Kieran Vale stepped onto the elevated stage. The spotlight struck his navy suit, casting a quiet authority over his frame. There was no delay, no introduction, just a man walking straight into the moment he had earned. Behind him, the screen flickered to life. A single image filled the space. A display case lit from beneath, its contents stark and symbolic, a folded, blood-stained navy jacket, and beside it, a partially used tube of toothpaste. The caption above them read, "Tools of humiliation, instruments of change." Gasps whispered through the audience. Not dramatic, not loud, just sharp intakes of breath as understanding settled in. Kieran stood still for a beat, then turned to face the crowd. Government officials, corporate executives, university students and journalists, men from across industries, backgrounds and allegiances, watched him in silence. Some with admiration, others with unease. "This," he began, his voice steady, "was supposed to be the moment that ended my credibility." No dramatic pause, no theatrics, just the weight of truth carried by a voice that didn't need to rise to be heard. I was seated on a flight, minding my own business, headed toward the deal of a lifetime. And because I wore a bandage on my shoulder, because I didn't fit the mold of who some believe deserves to succeed, I was attacked. He gestured toward the image behind him, not with anger, but with finality. "With this." The screen zoomed in, the toothpaste tube's faded brand name still visible, the cap cracked, dried paste clinging to its threads like a scar that refused to fade. For a moment, no one moved. Then Kieran walked to the edge of the stage. "I didn't come here today to retell that story," he said, "not to make anyone pity me. Not to ask for applause. I came here to show what silence costs and what resilience creates." He stopped and scanned the front row. Mason Redden sat at the far left, his eyes bright but unblinking, jaw set tight. Roland Merrick sat to the right, hands clasped, face solemn. Behind them, rows of men in charcoal suits leaned forward as if the truth might leap off Kieran's words and strike them where excuses used to live. I could have struck back in anger. I wanted to, Kieran admitted, but I waited. I built. I watched those who tried to undo me burn themselves with their own matches. He turned slowly, walking back toward center stage. A few journalists raised their cameras. The room held its breath. "I'm often asked what changed that day," he continued. "What changed me? The truth is, nothing. That flight didn't make me stronger. It revealed what kind of man I refused to stop being." His voice cracked slightly, not with emotion, but with gravity, like a stone dropped into deep water. A subtle buzz rippled through the audience. Not distraction, tension. "I still have the scar," Kieran said, lifting his arm just enough to catch the light across his jacket's shoulder. "But it doesn't ache anymore." "It reminds." He paused as a notification flickered on the screen behind him, unintentionally captured by the summit's automated display system. A press alert, Hellison board, dismantled amid criminal inquiry. Kieran saw it. So did the audience. He didn't acknowledge it aloud. Instead, he walked to the podium and pressed a button. The screen faded to black. "You've heard about laws, about reform, about accountability. That's important," he said. "But don't forget this. Systems don't change when victims shout. They change when survivors build something too strong to break." As he stepped back, a slow ripple of applause began from the center row. Roland rose, then Mason, then the room. The lights slowly rose as the summit director approached the stage, but Kieran didn't stay for congratulations. He walked down the side steps, moving past the rows of men still clapping, still staring at the screen that now read, simply, Meridian Ethics Initiative, Reforming Through Truth. Outside the venue, the early afternoon sun gleamed against the glass exterior. Kieran moved to the lobby's tall windows and stood silently, eyes tracking a single ray of light cutting across his reflection. The glass showed more than just his image, it showed the healed shoulder beneath his suit. A boy's voice somewhere behind him whispered, "That's him." But Kieran didn't turn. He closed his eyes just once. then opened them slowly and whispered so only he could hear. They gave me pain. I gave it purpose. He tried to humiliate a man in pain, and moments later watched his career dissolve in silence. If you believe dignity always wins, subscribe now, because justice cleans deeper than hate ever could. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores racism, humiliation, and the moment dignity triumphs over cruelty. Its purpose is to raise awareness, evoke empathy, and inspire reflection on justice, equality, and respect for every person.